Excellency.
Hey, all right, it's good to see you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. My name is Mark Purcell. I'm the CEO of the Australian Council for International Development, and I'd like to welcome you all here to the ANU's Crawford School of Public Policy. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting upon today, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and note that Indigenous Australians, through the Uluru Statement of the Heart, have set out an agenda for all of us to read, understand and to take up. We would like to welcome distinguished guests joining us here today, Her Excellency Camilla Solomon, the High Commissioner of Nauru, and Mr. Sakaias Tameo, the Deputy High Commissioner of Papua New Guinea. It's great to have you here. And thanks to all of you who are joining online. We know there's a big viewership as we go out live today for our third and final series in the election forums on Australia's development policy, where we get to hear from representatives of the major parties, their vision for how we will advance international development within the context of Australian foreign policy and their plans. These forums have been organised in a collaborative effort between the ANU's Development Policy Centre, which is, if I could say, the brains of the sector, the International Development Contractors Community, which is the juggernaut for the locomotive for the government's official aid program delivery, and the Australian Council for International Development, which represents organisations that are backed by millions of Australians who are making their own efforts into development in countries around the world. And we've come together because all three partners share a deep interest in the future of Australia's efforts in international development and what the parties' plans are there for. So, in particular, we want to understand how the parties will maximise the impact of Australia's official development program, what the resources are that they are dedicating to the development program and its management, and we're really delighted to have today the Honourable Zed Seselja, Senator Zed Seselja for ACT, but also Minister for International Development of the Pacific, who was elected to the Senate in 2013 and re-elected in 2016 and 2019, and we hope in 2022. He has taken up his role at a very, very tricky time in international affairs in December 2020, when Australia and the world were beset by COVID. And so it's it's a role that requires a lot of travel, and I just want to acknowledge that the Minister has made a lot of efforts in between very tight restrictions of different countries to get out to the Philippines, to Papua New Guinea, to Fiji, in order to carry out his responsibilities. And it's a role that really does require building relationships. And so I'm sure there's been a lot of virtual work, but in that sort of extraordinary time of lockdowns globally, the Minister was hard at work. It's also not often that you get to do a personal thanks, but prior to the Minister taking up his role, he was the Minister for Charities in the coalition government. And when JobKeeper came in, through an anomaly in the regulations, international NGOs were actually excluded from availing themselves of that tremendous scheme. And so it was through the intervention of Minister Seselja and Minister Frydenberg and the staff in their offices that international NGOs were able to be included. So I wanted to thank you on behalf of the sector, because that was a truly important scheme. Also, the Minister has been very, very available to the sector, as has his staff, over the time in his role, and we've had very many productive dialogues. So we wanted to acknowledge that as well. So it's with great interest that we look forward to hearing what he has to say, and that the Minister's statement is going to be followed by a conversation with Louise Maher, who's known to you all now. Louise is a very, very highly regarded Australian journalist and presenter and producer. Many shows and programs on the ABC and 7 years in the Federal Press Gallery. Her podcast, Collected, showcases the stories behind the Australian War Memorial here in Canberra. And if you go up to the National Portrait Gallery as well, tune in to In Their Own Words, which has all the stories and histories behind the portraits in the gallery. So thank you, Louise, for moderating our conversation today. Now, without further ado, the Minister for International Development, Zed Seselja.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. It's great to be with you, and thank you to the ANU's Development Policy Centre, the Australian Council for International Development, and the International Development Contractors community. Thank you for the invitation to address this forum today. You all play a very critical role in shaping and delivering Australia's international development program, and I thank you for that. I've appreciated your engagement and advice in my first 18 months as Minister for International Development and the Pacific. And I hope to continue working closely with you as Minister for International Development and the Pacific if the Coalition is re-elected, but that is in the hands of the people in 8 days' time. It's been an honour so far to serve in this portfolio. It's one that aligns closely with values that I hold dear, including compassion, generosity and integrity. Now, this is a timely opportunity to lay out the government's approach to Australia's international development program. Partnerships for Recovery has been a critical strategy guiding our approach. Relationships are at the core of this strategy. We're partnering with countries in our region to support their priorities. And we are working to promote Australian values and interests as well. For the Coalition, this is about delivering results, not rhetoric. We've steered Australia through some of the most challenging and complex circumstances our country and our region has faced. We've delivered record levels of development assistance to the Pacific and Timor-Leste. Our COVID-19 temporary and targeted initiatives, combined with our $1.5 billion loan to Indonesia, is Australia's largest investment in Southeast Asia since the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. We've provided our region with over $1 billion in additional ODA over this period. We've stood up to economic coercion at home and introduced critical new tools to support economic growth abroad. Second, we are ensuring Australia's development program is part of an integrated foreign policy toolkit. Our development program supports human development and international peace and stability. We have a whole-of-government approach to both objectives, because we cannot separate development and foreign aid from its broader context. The development program is seen as an integral aspect of our foreign policy and a crucial tool to make the world a better, more just and humane place. Our ODA budget is the central aspect of our development program, but is not the only aspect of our development program. Beyond our ODA budget, the Coalition has ensured Australia is utilising the full suite of government capabilities to support development efforts in the region. Our non-ODA assets, from defence cooperation to labour mobility to diplomacy to economic cooperation, are making critical contributions to the Coalition's integrated whole-of-government development and foreign policy efforts. Third, the Coalition's approach to development is based on pursuing Australia's values and interests. As the Prime Minister has said, we have a moral and economic duty to support our neighbours. We are engaged in partnerships which respond to our neighbours' priorities. Our development program is making an important contribution to poverty alleviation, to helping the most marginalised and to improving lives across our region. We're ensuring that we concentrate on delivering quality in our development program. It's building human capital through investment in health and education. It is addressing gender equality by investing in programs which give women and girls the opportunities to realise their full potential. And it's also making an enormously important contribution to the security, stability and prosperity of our region. Fourth, the Coalition Government has recognised the fundamental change in our strategic circumstances and is adapting our development program to suit. We've innovated, bringing new tools to support development outcomes. The Coalition has focused our development program on the Indo-Pacific, where we have a comparative advantage. And we continue to be good global citizens in support of the international rules-based system. Now let me expand on these themes. Our development program has played a central role in Australia's support to our region as it responds to COVID. We're providing over $1.1 billion in ODA and nearly 33 million vaccines above and beyond the baseline aid budget to help our region address COVID. Now, these vaccine doses and our end-to-end support for vaccine delivery have been the critical factor in allowing many Pacific countries to manage COVID-19 and reopen to the world. In parallel, we've used the development program to shore up safety nets in Fiji, Tonga, Timor-Leste and elsewhere during COVID, providing an additional $300 million to help countries in our region manage fiscal risks. Australia's funding has helped to ensure that the health crisis in our region hasn't turned into a destabilising economic or security crisis. We do all this because it is the right thing to do and the smart thing to do. Now, human development is rightly placed at the centre of human security in our development efforts. The Morrison government is also clear-eyed about the challenges in our region. The international environment is changing at a rapid pace. As the Prime Minister has said, an arc of autocracy from Beijing to Moscow is challenging the rules-based world order. COVID has had profound health, economic and social impacts. Coercion, disinformation and foreign interference are on the rise. These trends hinder development, trade and economic growth, but most worryingly, they undermine the trust and strong bonds we share across the region. In short, our development program no longer enjoys the more benign geostrategic environment of the late 90s and early 2000s. Russia's illegal war in Ukraine provides a clear example of the negative development impacts. Tens of thousands have been killed, millions displaced. Ukraine's economy is expected to halve. The World Bank has assessed that up to 30% of its population is living in poverty. We've responded immediately with $65 million to protect women, children and the elderly, including for food, shelter and emergency medical supplies. But clearly, humanitarian support is not enough to push back against Russia's unrelenting brutality. So we are providing over $225 million of military assistance to support Ukraine's response. In Ukraine, as elsewhere, we no longer have the luxury of supporting development assistance in isolation from security and stability. Closer to home, authoritarian states such as Russia and China are challenging the international order. We've seen this in Ukraine and most recently through China's security agreement with the Solomon Islands. Issues such as predatory and opaque lending, coercion and foreign interference are threats to sovereignty and stability, but they're threats to development as well. These trends are undermining economic stability, transparency, sovereignty and democratic norms in our region. The development program outlined by Pat Conroy here on Monday focused on human development, health and education, and these are essential public goods. The Coalition has been investing heavily in these areas and remains absolutely committed to addressing them. But pretending they are our region's only challenges ignores the reality of the world we now face and pursues a narrow vision of development. Coalition believes that Australia's development program provides us with a strong basis to counter the complex challenges our region faces. It has generated goodwill and positive relationships across our region and across generations. It has built human capital across our region. It is ensuring mothers survive childbirth, that children survive childhood, and that those children are better educated and skilled to contribute to their nation's development. During 2020-21, our development program reached 157 million people with new or improved social protection programs. Our support helped the government of Timor-Leste expand its social protection system, including providing $62 million in emergency cash transfers to 95% of households. In 2020, our stepped-up support in global health helped Global Fund and Gavi to vaccinate 64 million children, provide 21.9 million people with antiretroviral therapy for HIV, and treat 4.7 million people for tuberculosis. But our development program is just one of a suite of tools we can use to shape our international environment for the better. Alongside our diplomacy, defence and people-to-people links, our development program helps us build meaningful partnerships. For example, our practical development cooperation initiatives were no doubt helpful in building relationships with ASEAN countries, which in turn supported ASEAN's agreement to a comprehensive strategic partnership with Australia. We believe that development, security and growth are indivisible and must be addressed together. That's why Australia is working with our partners to build resilience and support the rule of law in our region. At home, we've been clear and consistent in defending Australia's democratic values against significant pressure. Our international relationships across the PIF and ASEAN and the Quad and AUKUS are defending common values and principles. And our development program is giving practical support to democratic institutions. We support the conduct of elections, including in PNG, Fiji, Tonga and the Solomon Islands. Our police forces, courts and justice agencies are working with partners to provide security, policing and justice support. We speak out in defence of international human rights and we support free and vibrant media environments. No country, not Australia nor any Pacific nation nor any in Southeast Asia, can enjoy economic development or human security in the absence of stability. Coalition sees the development program making a fundamental contribution to shared prosperity, shared stability and shared security across our region. I'm proud that the Morrison government has responded with speed and urgency to the unprecedented challenges our region faces. Our latest budget continues that effort. I reiterate here the new funding announcements made by the government in March. We are doubling AIFF lending headroom to $3 billion. There have been ODA increases right across the map for 2022-23. We're providing an additional $324 million in economic support for the Pacific, front-loaded in 2022-23. This funding will provide economic and social support to aid COVID-19 recovery in the Pacific and Timor-Leste. Critical health, education and social protection services can continue to be provided by governments facing reduced revenues and higher COVID-19 related expenditure. It will provide technical expertise to assist governments access reputable and transparent international finance mechanisms, including those related to climate financing. We're providing an additional $98.3 million in targeted funding for the Vaccines Access and Health Security Initiative. We're providing an additional $13.6 million for Pacific labour mobility as part of our streamlining of the Pacific Labour Scheme and Seasonal Workers Program. Including these temporary and targeted measures, Australia will spend a record $1.85 billion in ODA in the Pacific in 2022-23. Compare this to the $1.1 billion in 2012-13, the last budget before we came to office. In total, we'll provide an estimated $4.549 billion in ODA in 2022-23. In total, the Morrison government is providing an additional $460 million in ODA in 2022-23 for temporary, targeted and supplementary measures, over $330 million of which is for the Pacific. Compare this to Labor's offer of $130 million in additional ODA per annum for the Pacific. Now, I'll come back to that plan later, but I for now ask you to contrast the detail I've just outlined against Labor's vague and uncosted policy prescriptions. What is its Pacific ODA funding for, and where is the detail of Labor's global ODA commitment? Over 9 years, the Coalition has delivered a comprehensive whole-of-government approach, including ODA, development finance, security cooperation and climate investment to respond to the region's needs and Australia's priorities. Our non-ODA expenditure is increasingly important to achieving development outcomes. We've delivered $2.7 billion in bilateral loans to support Papua New Guinea and Indonesia to support them through COVID economic impacts. We've done this at the request of those governments. We'll spend $1.85 billion in the coming year in ODA in the Pacific, but $2.7 billion in total support to the Pacific, including our aid, security, health and financial support. We've established the AIFF, now with $3 billion in loan finance for critical economic infrastructure in the Pacific and Timor-Leste, backed by $500 million in grant financing. The government is committed to over $900 million for 10 critical infrastructure Pacific projects. We have a pipeline of 22 projects across 11 countries, valued at over $2 billion. These include Tina River Hydro Power Transmission Line in the Solomon Islands and a $580 million ports redevelopment project in Papua New Guinea. We've expanded Export Finance Australia's mandate to increase finance to the region. We are supporting Australian companies to invest in the Pacific, including Telstra's bid for Digicel Pacific. We've delivered the Coral Sea cable to PNG and Solomon Islands. We've supported countries' COVID responses across the region and provided nearly 33 million doses so far. We've opened 6 new diplomatic posts, Marshall Islands, French Polynesia, Niue, Palau, Tuvalu and Cook Islands, in the Pacific since 2018. Australia is the only country with diplomatic posts in every PIF country. We've responded to emergencies and crises through a mixture of ODA and non-ODA funding. Australia was the first country Solomon Islands called upon when unrest began, and we responded in 12 hours. And Australia responded decisively to Tonga's requests for assistance following its recent volcanic eruption and tsunami. Now, the HMAS Adelaide and other ADF assets were critical to our Tonga and Solomon Islands humanitarian responses, and indeed previously to that in Fiji. Defence expenditure is not ODA eligible, but has a very significant impact on peace, security and economic growth. We've procured a Pacific support vessel capable of delivering both humanitarian and disaster relief missions as needed across the Pacific. The $2 billion Pacific Maritime Security Program, which has already delivered 14 out of 21 pledged Guardian-class patrol boats and upgraded wharf infrastructure across our region. These vessels are protecting Pacific fisheries resources and protecting our region against the smuggling of weapons and drugs. We've delivered the Australia Pacific Security College here at the Australian National University to train Pacific security professionals. We've established Pacific Fusion Centre based out of Vanuatu to deliver training and strategic analysis on security priorities identified by PIF countries. We've delivered BlackRock humanitarian and peacekeeping camp in Fiji, $100 million in non-ODA eligible defence infrastructure, which is supporting peacekeepers and humanitarian responses. The redevelopment of Longborough Naval Base in PNG is supporting both jobs and stability in our nearest neighbour. And the border and patrol boat outposts in the Solomon Islands are a further demonstration that we are investing in practical partnerships with our Pacific neighbours. In all these ways, the Morrison government has stepped up. We've expanded the toolkit to support both development and stability. Our policy settings have predicted the more contested global environment and have meant Australia is well placed to respond. Yes, we see ODA as central to our foreign policy and development goals, but we also recognise that ODA is only one of several tools that support these goals. On climate as well, the Coalition has a strong record of delivering results, not rhetoric. The $22 million Palau solar project will deliver 20% of Palau's energy needs through clean energy. Our $60 million in grant and loan finance for the Tina River Hydro project will help Solomon Islands deliver clean energy to Honiara. We're delivering on our commitment of $2 billion in climate finance between 2020 and 2025. This commitment will see at least $700 million flowing to meet the Pacific's needs. And we've supported Pacific delegations to attend COP and our Oceans Conference. At home too, Australia's 2050 net zero target demonstrates our commitment to take significant and meaningful action to reduce emissions. Australia's emissions are now lower than in any year under the previous government and at their lowest levels since records began. Emissions are now 20% below 2005 levels, and between 2005 and 2019 our emissions fell faster than Canada, New Zealand, Japan, the United States, and significantly faster than the OECD average. Current projections show we'll overachieve on our 2030 target of a 26 to 28% reduction on 2005 levels. Ladies and gentlemen, going forward, you can expect a coalition government to maintain a strong focus on security, stability and economic growth. We'll continue to focus on results, not rhetoric. We'll deliver real partnerships for our developing country partners and their people and real value for the Australian taxpayer. Geographically, we will continue to focus on our region while remaining a responsible global citizen. We will continue to take serious moral stance on development issues. You can expect continued attention to ensuring the development program is directly addressing poverty alleviation and supporting the most marginalised in societies. You can expect a continued focus on gender equality. And you can expect a continued focus on resilience of populations and individuals. We'll build on partnerships for recovery, delivering further practical assistance in health security, economic recovery and stability. As Australia's geostrategic environment continues to shift, it will be appropriate for a new government to lay out a new approach. We'll look to more fully integrate the development objectives of our ODA and non-ODA funding. But our strategy will continue to be an expression of Australia's values and interests. And we will continue to prioritise genuine partnerships with countries across our region. And we will continue to prioritise using the ODA budget and other tools to continue to improve the lives of people in our region while remaining a good global citizen. Now, in just over a week, the Australian people will face a choice. Labor's Pacific policy announcements prove it doesn't understand the strategic challenge our country is facing. It's a pale and incoherent version of what the Coalition has already been delivering. Labor doesn't have an agenda for how Australia can respond to insecurity and instability in our region. It has expressed no view in responding to economic risks in our region. Labor's Pacific Maritime Security announcement is an extension of an existing program. No new thinking there. Labor's Australia Pacific Defence School is duplicative and unnecessary. We already have substantial and highly effective programs for defence training and have already established the Australia Pacific Security College and the Pacific Fusion Centre. And while the Coalition has been delivering tangible assistance through loan financing, Labor has made the underwhelming commitment to delivering a review of development financing. Its Pacific Climate Infrastructure Financing Partnership is no more than a rebadging of the AIFFP's existing climate window. I don't think Labor has even bothered to Google the AIFFP website. So while the Coalition has introduced critical new tools to respond to the complexity in our geopolitical environment, Labor is proposing exactly nothing new. On infrastructure financing, they're also having a bet each way. Labor will happily rebadge the AIFFP's existing work to deliver a climate infrastructure financing partnership. But as Pat Conroy told this forum on Monday, Labor would rebalance the aid program away from infrastructure and towards human development. I see this as a serious misreading of what the Pacific nations are telling us they want. Mr. Conroy simply can't finance climate infrastructure while also rebalancing away from infrastructure. It's very unclear which direction they are going in. What Labor has announced is vague and uncosted. More Pacific funding has been announced, but what is Labor proposing to use it for? And where is the detail of Labor's broader ODA platform? How will it get to its 0.5% ODA to GNI ratio it has promised? All these are important questions which must be answered prior to the election. In closing, ladies and gentlemen, I reiterate that Australia's ODA is an immensely important way of addressing poverty, instability and insecurity in our region. But ODA is only one of a number of ways we address these issues. The Coalition has a track record of delivering results. We've focused on the Indo-Pacific as the region which will determine Australia's future prosperity and security while continuing to be good global citizens. We have navigated this country's development program through the greatest global disruption in decades, and we have a positive vision for how our development program can adapt and respond to the challenges of our times. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Minister, for that comprehensive account of the Coalition's priorities, plans and in fact achievements. You spoke about the very serious and indeed unprecedented challenges that we're facing at the moment. The instability caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine, climate change, shifting geopolitical allegiances in the Pacific. Do you think that Australians now, because of this, have a better understanding of the importance of our aid development program? And if not, how do you convince them of the need for us to invest soundly and wisely and substantially into the future?
Yeah, look, that's a very good question, and it's one that certainly from before my time in this portfolio, but very much during my 18 months or so in this portfolio has occupied a lot of my thinking and many of the discussions that I have, whether it's with local constituents, whether it's stakeholders, whether it's the community more broadly, about what all this means, because the issues around aid have always been there's always been a level of controversy around them, a level of controversy about if you're spending money overseas, well, you could be spending that money here in Australia, and there's always more we can do in Australia, of course. But I do think that going, I think, to the more pointed part of your question, I do think that there has been a slight shift in sentiment. I think there'll always be some who would say we shouldn't spend anything on aid, or we should spend less on aid, and those sort of things. And I know there's been a lot of debate, and of course in these forums, about what that level should be. But what we have seen is a couple of things happen, and I think the community has been broadly accepting of that in the time I've been in the portfolio. Is certainly there has been a bigger focus on aid and ODA and other spend in our region, in our immediate region. We've seen a higher proportion of our overall spend spent right here in the Pacific, and the feedback I get from the community is people very much see the relevance of that. They see that it's a good thing to do with our neighbours. They have a great fondness for our region. I think Australians want to see us generous beyond our region as well, but I think perhaps there's a greater desire to see it closer to home, I suppose, than in far-flung areas of the globe. Although when we respond to great challenges in Afghanistan or the Ukraine, I think there's a lot of community support as well, as there should be. But we have seen, as I say, that aid budget going. We've spent more in a temporary and targeted way during this time, but that's now over 2 or 3 years and going forward for the next couple of years. So obviously, around that $4.5 billion total, and around that $1.8 billion total in the Pacific. So I think the community sort of sees not just that it's the right thing to do, but also that it is in our interest to do it as well. I'd make another point that during COVID, I think when we were, delivering vaccines to Fiji, to Timor-Leste, and to Southeast Asia, right through the Pacific, I think there was a lot of goodwill for doing that. I think people saw that was absolutely the right thing to do morally, but again, I think people saw that it was in everyone's interests to make sure that there was access to vaccines. And I'd give one little anecdote on the vaccines. I mean, I think if you look at Fiji as one example of a country that really got hit more economically than virtually any other country in the world on the figures during COVID, its economy went backwards at one point by around 20% because of the hit to tourism. To deliver well over 1 million vaccines to a population that's about 900,000 really has been able to see Fiji open up again, and therefore the economic devastation that was there I think they're very much on their way to recovery.
You've also talked a lot recently about the very strong engagement that Australia has with the Pacific, including record aid expenditure to the Pacific, and the fact that Australia is the partner of choice. But after what's transpired with China and the Solomons, you've had a few weeks to reflect now on that. What are your reflections on what Australia and the Australian government has learned, and what, based on being able to look back, what the government may have done differently to have secured a different outcome?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what we've learned, and not just in these last few weeks, but what we've been increasingly aware of for the last few years has been the changing nature of the geostrategic challenge in the region, and obviously this push by China, and we've seen it with things like Belt and Road initiatives over the years, including signing with some state governments in Australia, and certainly with nations across the world, that's been used obviously to expand Chinese influence all around the world, and in some cases it's been coercive, and certainly I would make the point that the way the Chinese government operates is certainly different to the way we operate when we deal as partners in the region. And so, I think that the prescriptions for solutions to these challenges that have been put forward have been very, very weak. We initially heard critique that if the aid budget was more, that would have dealt with it, where our aid budget in the Pacific is at record levels, going up rapidly, by far the most of any government anywhere in the world in terms of what we deliver to the Pacific. There was some claims that it was about climate change, but if you look at what we're doing on climate change, climate financing projects, and indeed engagement, but also you look at the fact that China, who's signed this deal with the Solomon Islands, is the largest emitter in the world. I don't think those critiques stack up. So what we have known, and what has become increasingly apparent, is that we have changed strategic circumstances. They are very challenging strategic circumstances, and anyone who thinks that if having increased the aid budget in the Pacific by about 70% since we came to government, that if only it had gone up 80% or 90%, that would have been the difference, I think is quite naive. So, we're dealing with those challenges. The broader point I made in the speech, which I think is worth reflecting on in answer to this question as well, is that that aid is one part of the toolkit, and there is so much more that Australia does in the region, and we need to continue to do that. We need to continue to be the partner of choice, but in the end, we don't have absolute power to stop sovereign nations from making decisions that we disagree with. We certainly make a very strong case. We certainly point to our very strong record, and that dialogue continues. And I think the other aspect of the response to these challenges is the importance of that regional dialogue. And I think that was one of the disappointing aspects of this, is that, and certainly we've spoken to our Pacific partners both virtually, in person. I've had a number of meetings in recent times as we've seen them in Australia. Obviously, Maurice has been having that kind of engagement as well. And, that regional dialogue will be absolutely part of that solution, because I think the concerns about this agreement go well beyond Australia.
You talk about the ODA being one aspect of it. If you look at the Department of Defence, they have the ability to look down the track, 30, 40 years down the track, and to plan accordingly, to invest, to have the funding to be able to prepare for what they see coming way into the future. Do you think there's an argument for that sort of planning and that sort of funding security to be available in the aid development sphere as well?
Well, you'd always any minister for this space would always be arguing for more funding for your portfolio, and certainly as much security as you can.
Not just funding though, the security, the strategic planning that we see in defence, for example, with the AUKUS program. Yeah,
indeed, and I think if you look at a range of the measures we've put in place in terms of the Pacific Step Up, it very much has been about that long-term planning and long-term investment, and that's one of the differences too. And if we talk about how other countries do things a bit differently, when we invest in health and health outcomes, for instance, they are long-term investments. They are long-term investments in our region. I mean, I was there at Angao in PNG opening a new hospital. I mean, those kind of investments take years, and they're not the sugar hit type investments, but they are very, very important for the long-term stability and the health outcomes for PNG in that case. But we're seeing other similar investments. We're seeing partnerships like that happening in places like Fiji, where I visited, where we're partnering with private providers as well, but big Australian investments. So the long-term planning absolutely is there. In terms of having absolute long-term funding certainty, I think that's always problematic in virtually every policy area. But the trajectory has been very strong. But as I say, it's the defence and security spend can't just be isolated completely from our ODA spend. I mean, I'll use this one example just to highlight, I guess, how we count ODA just does not even reflect our humanitarian response. So this is true when we responded to Cyclone Yasa. It was true with the recent responses to the tsunami in Tonga, for instance. We deploy HMAS Adelaide, HMAS Canberra, other large deployments of military personnel in order to deliver humanitarian aid. It's a humanitarian mission, it's not a military mission, but it's conducted by the military. Now, in terms of what counts as ODA, it is literally the pallets of goods that are on the ships, but all of the resources that go in from our military don't count towards our technical aid budget. But I tell you what, if you talk to someone on the ground and the military are delivering that humanitarian aid, that's as good as any other humanitarian aid. And it's just one example of how there's a crossover between what Defence does, between what Home Affairs does in the case of security and stability, and what we do through our more traditional direct ODA budget.
Okay. I'm aware that there are a lot of questions in the room, so we'll go to questions now. First to questions from our sponsors. We also have the media here as well, so I'll come to them as well, and we'll open up to questions from the floor. I would ask you if you would state your name and the organisation you're representing before you ask your question. Our first question today is from Mark Purcell from ACFID.
Thanks, myself and Acford. Minister, thanks for that fantastic overview. Just to ask you some questions about the current framing of Australia's aid program. So we're focusing in the Pacific, but clearly we've gone to Afghanistan and Ukraine. So would a re-elected coalition government assist the emerging humanitarian crises in East Horn of Africa and Yemen, for example? And then, given the complex geostrategic environment that Australia now finds itself in, given that our relationships are enduring, but the situation that we're in is going to be ongoing, should temporary targeted measures be made permanent?
On the latter, obviously that's going to be a matter for future budgets. I think there's no doubt that we've seen that temporary targeted response that's now been there for a couple of years and is projected to be there for at least the next few years in the budget, and it's dealing with these challenges. So I suppose we've crossed a threshold, and then there'll be a question for future governments, be it us or other governments, as to what that trajectory looks like. And so I couldn't preempt that. I would say at a personal level, I think what we've spent has been responsible and reasonable in the circumstances, and it's been what's needed. One of the things, and you do get into, frankly, some commentary where it's I wouldn't say it's gotcha, but it's where when we were talking about temporary and targeted at the height of the pandemic, it was about, in some cases, getting that money and those vaccines out as quickly as possible. And then I remember some people saying, well, it's actually dropping off next year, you're spending less next year. And it's like, well, there's temporary and targeted measures, there's a package, I'm going to spend them as soon as we can get them out there because they're needed right now. And so it needs to be looked at in that context. So I guess the short answer to your question, the second part of your question is, I think future governments will make that decision. As I say, I think it's been a reasonable response to the circumstances we face, but I don't get to make that decision. Even if I'm re-elected, obviously I'd be part of that decision-making process. So your earlier question...
is around our humanitarian
overall
responses globally.
Yep.
We have gone beyond the Indo-Pacific, but there's pressing crises now in Yemen, in Africa with drought and malnourishment.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I'm certainly, I think we're always open to what we can do in the various humanitarian crises that happen around the world. You're right, we do focus in our region first and foremost, but we do go beyond it. We go to Afghanistan, to Ukraine, other places where there are humanitarian crises, and that's good that we do that. One other point I would make is that, and because we do get a bad rap for this, but I think there's actually a very good story in the fact that we are one of the few countries who actually goes well beyond our shores and indeed well beyond our region, and has humanitarian resettlement of refugees from refugee camps that are not in our space. And I remember visiting in a previous role. I had settlement services, and I remember going to the Thai-Myanmar border to refugee camps there, where Australia has you would argue, no direct interest in there, but we, as a global citizen, go there and we resettle those people. And when we do resettle them, per capita, we spend basically more than virtually any other country on resettlement. We don't count that towards our humanitarian program, though many other countries do. And if we did, our aid program would be about 20% higher than it is. That's just a statement of fact. So that's another way where we go beyond even our immediate region in a humanitarian context. And it often is dealing with the fallout from conflict and challenge, whether that's Afghanistan, where we're taking more, whether that's now in Ukraine, or whether it's in other parts of the world where there's been longer term displacements.
Thank you, Mark. Our next question comes from Jane Haycock from IDCC. Jane.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you, Senator Seselja. Today, and also in your speech to the Asia Link Leaders Summit in February, we set out in some considerable detail the Coalition's plans for ODA in the Pacific. Could you also outline for us today how the Coalition will approach building durable development partnerships across our region, and the scale and nature of investment we can expect to see in Southeast Asia and the financial support behind these?
Yeah, look, absolutely. we, again, our immediate region, you're right, the Pacific, we do, and as Minister for the Pacific, I do have a particular focus there, but into Southeast Asia, our development assistance is, I think this coming year, it'll be a little over about $1.15 billion into Southeast Asia. And that doesn't count some of the loans and other assistance we've given, which, as I pointed out in my speech, has been quite substantial, particularly into Indonesia. So around $1.15 billion. When I visited the Philippines last year, I think it was, had the opportunity, obviously, I got to say, it was quite a restricted trip. I was sort of, in face shields as well as masks and almost confined to the hotel, but I did have the great opportunity to meet with a number of important partners and see how in a place like the Philippines, which is obviously in Southeast Asia, where we're able to actually deliver quite significant development assistance. I think, from memory, we are still one of the Philippines' largest partners. I think it's about the tune of, I don't have it on the top of my head, I think it's about $70 or $80 million a year that we deliver to a place like the Philippines. So there's a lot of that happening, but we're also seeing the depth of our partnerships in Southeast Asia growing. We've seen the comprehensive strategic partnership with ASEAN and then with a number of Southeast Asian nations. That is, I think, a really important step forward in our relationships in that region. And so what we're doing in aid, as I say, is about $1.15 billion this year, but the depth of the relationships is getting greater. And the trading aspect has actually been an important story in this period, where we're all aware of some of the unstated or stated sanctions that we saw in terms of our trade with China. And we did see some of our exports restricted into there, but we did actually see significant uptick in our trading relationships with ASEAN. And so that is also, I think, another example of how that depth of relationship is growing in the region.
Thanks, Jane. Our next question is from Beth Orton from the Development Policy Centre.
Hi. We were hoping that you could speak a bit more on the Coalition's vision for Pacific labour mobility, and if that vision would include permanent pathways for migration for participants in those programs.
So the short answer is there is very much an openness to going down that path as we reform our Pacific Labour Scheme. So the Pacific Labour Scheme has, I think, been a great success story. We're all aware of when there's been some challenges in that, and various committees and things, and we deal with, I think, when there's been problems. But overwhelmingly, I think we've got now around that 25,000 mark of participants under that scheme in Australia at the moment. That's been an absolute lifeline for many of our regional communities, but it's also been an economic lifeline in our region, because for a number of those countries, it is amongst their biggest exports. In terms of the money coming in remittances, it is amongst the biggest parts of their economy. I think Tonga is one of those, and there's a number of other countries where it's a very substantial part of their economy. So a real lifeline to those communities, and I think there's a great desire to see it happen. We are reforming that visa, as you would be aware, and so I think that's going to, we're putting more resources into the sort of support structures that are there. We're moving to 4-year visas, we're moving to multiple entries. So all of that is quite positive. The permanent migration pathways is something we are keen to explore, but it's not something you can, I think, just do in isolation from the Pacific nations themselves, because there are challenges in that if you were to just, in a sort of a blanket way without proper consultation, allow that. Obviously, there's potential for brain drain and other things, and we want to make sure that the relationships, that we're respecting the will of those nations, and we're not seeing just their best and brightest coming here. Of course, we want to see them be able to come here, but we also want to see those communities and those island nations continue to thrive and have some of those, that great labour force and those great, those skilled workers in their economies as well. So that's the balance we'll be looking to strike, but I think there's very much an openness, and we're going to sort of pursue a bit of a process if we're re-elected.
Thanks, Beth. I think we might take a question from the media now. Yes, Stephen?
Hi, Senator. Stephen Jedges from ABC. I might ask a two-part question, if that's all right. The first on China. As you know, Australia still does cooperate in limited ways with China in the development space in the Pacific, for example, on malaria control in PNG. Given the deteriorating level of strategic trust between Australia and China, particularly in the wake of the Solomon Islands Pact, are those avenues of cooperation still possible going forward? And does Australia anticipate it will continue to look for limited opportunities to cooperate with China in Pacific development? And secondly, you talk about ODA being just one tool in the toolkit. Can I ask, there was a lot of talk last year about the prospect of a broader compact with the Pacific, taking in things such as labour mobility, possible migration pathways. Now that didn't seem to come to pass. Is that something that a future coalition government is still contemplating, particularly when it comes to opening up new migration pathways?
Yeah. So on the first question, you're right. There is still some of that cooperation. I still see that as a positive thing because in the end, if it's fighting malaria, we obviously want to see. In the end, the goal is to tackle that disease, and rather than who does it. But of course, you're right to point out that is becoming more challenging. It's becoming more challenging, and I guess the prospect in the short term of new cooperation in development in the region is perhaps not that high at the moment. I would like it to be different. We would like the relationship to be a better one than it is, but I don't think it's Australia that has changed in relation to the relationship. I think it's very much a changed approach that has come from China. So there'd still be a hope, but I wouldn't be necessarily expecting that we'll see in the immediate term, other projects like that taking off. In terms of, I guess, the question of broader compact and your focus particularly on Pacific labour and migration pathways, I do think there is scope for greater integration between Australia and Pacific Island nations, and I think that will come in a number of important ways, and Pacific labour is one important part of that, and potentially having migration pathways attached to that, of course, builds those relationships. But other things that build strong relationships, which we're already doing, which we want to build on, are of course in our shared sporting partnerships, church partnerships, and in the education space. I think there's significant prospect for growth, and there's a number of things that have certainly been explored in recent months about how you could provide more opportunities, perhaps first on a pilot basis and then maybe in a more integrated way, to see more people from Pacific Island nations studying in Australia, whether that's at a high school level or indeed at a university or TAFE level. And we have certainly examined some of those aspects when it comes to training being an add-on of the Pacific Labour Scheme, so that you're looking at what possibilities there are. So obviously there's been a lot of focus on horticulture, on fruit picking, on meatworks. We've branched out now into aged care, which is obviously comes with different sort of skills requirements, and so the skilling up of those workforces as they come in is serving two purposes. It's potentially underpinning the scheme and making it a more effective scheme for everyone, but it's also opening some pathways into our education system as well.
Thank you, Stephen. SBS?
Louise Maher from SBS. Labor has a plan to scrap the agriculture visa apart from the MOU with Vietnam and refocus on employing more people from the Pacific. How do you respond to that idea?
Well, I think you need both. I mean, and I think that's the conclusion we've drawn. We are. I mean, if you talk to employers across Australia at the moment, there are very few who wouldn't be saying that they are suffering labour shortages at the moment, and so obviously we need to look at how we responsibly respond to that. And the judgment we have made is it's not either or. We have said that the Pacific Labour Scheme will continue to be our primary focus when it comes to those type of schemes, because it's been a great success. There is a strong pipeline of workers there, and we're seeing that growth, and we've seen a really significant growth in recent times, up to around that 25,000 mark, which was set out last year as a goal, and we've gotten there. So delivering that, I think, is important, but the Southeast Asian scheme, or the agricultural visa, is about complementing that and building on that and ensuring that our farmers do have the kind of labour force they need. There has been some other changes that have factored into this as well. There's been changes through our free trade agreement with the UK, which has changed some of the requirements in terms of working in regional areas. And so the agriculture visa is an important part of the response to that, but we just don't see it as an either or. But just finally, from the outset, when this visa was first flagged, from Maurice Payne, myself and the Prime Minister have all made it very clear that our Pacific Labour Scheme will continue to be our focus. This wouldn't undermine it, and we've seen the evidence of that because we've seen it continue to grow, and that's what we'd anticipate would happen if we're re-elected.
Thank you. Okay, a question from the floor now. Yes.
Minister Stephen Howes from the Development Policy Centre. You mentioned that aid to Pacific's gone up and is at a record level. We also know that total aid has gone down since the coalition came to office in 2013 by about 25%, after inflation. So why is it that it's good to give more aid to the Pacific, but it's good to cut aid everywhere else, including in Southeast Asia and other parts of the Indo-Pacific?
Well, Stephen, I mean, I think you're probably, I guess, obviously looking back to 2014, perhaps, and some of the budgetary responses that we saw then. What we have seen in recent times, and certainly in the time I've been in the portfolio, is that we are doing more overall. And absolutely, we are doing more as a proportion in the region. And, so... And I guess I'll just make one other final point before I talk a bit about specifically the aid to the region, is that even some of those figures we talk about, we simply don't count all of the actual aid spend we do in the region just because of the rules. And I'm not disputing that those rules are in there for a reason, but whether it's the humanitarian response, whether it's our refugee program, a number of other things that are actually aid in anyone's language, are actually being delivered. But when it comes to why we spend so much in the region as a proportion, that has been a rebalancing. Absolutely, it has been a rebalancing under our government. It was a much, much smaller proportion, and in actual terms, in actual dollar terms, it was much less. It was $1.1 billion of aid to the Pacific when we came to government. It's now $1.85 billion, and we certainly don't make any apology for that. But as I pointed out in my speech, it's $1.85 billion in aid, and it's about $2.7 billion in overall assistance. So we are doing a lot, and we are doing it primarily, yes, in our immediate region, but also taking account of some of those broader global challenges.
Okay, thank you. Do we have another question from the floor? Yes.
Hi, Minister. John Hawley, Plan International Australia. Just wondering if you could speak to the logic of not utilising the Australian humanitarian partnership for response within Afghanistan. It seems in a growingly insecure world, you need all the tools in your toolbox, and there's been this particular tool that's not being used.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, the challenge in Afghanistan has been well documented in terms of just obviously our ability now to deliver aid and to assist people in great difficulty in Afghanistan because of the nature of obviously the withdrawal that occurred last year. But we are supporting people in Afghanistan. We're supporting them through humanitarian visas and through the upping of those humanitarian visas, and we are supporting aid goals through a substantial program of financing. So, look, in terms of exactly how you get that done, I guess that's a matter for debate. But I think we have to take account of the fact that the situation on the ground in Afghanistan is obviously far more problematic than it has been and very challenging, but there is still a desire to, as much as possible, to assist people in great difficulty there. I mean, it's not uncommon, I'm sure it wouldn't be for you, even on the campaign trail where I will meet people from Afghanistan and we are taking up their case of their family members and others, but it is with great difficulty at the moment. I think we're all aware of that.
I think we have time for one more question from the floor.
Hi, Natasha Chabra from ACFID. Minister, as you're aware, people with disabilities are amongst the most severely impacted by disasters, conflict and COVID. Despite this, funding for the disability core allocation within the aid program was reduced by 25% in 2020, and it's remained at that level in the recent budget despite the overall increase in aid. What reassurance can you give that people with disabilities will be prioritised in the aid program, and when can we expect core funding for people with disabilities to increase?
Well, thank you for the question. On the second part of that question, it's difficult for me to give you an answer on what would be in future budgets, but obviously that will be looked at in the context of the budget process for next year. We have been obviously in the overall increase in aid, not just to our region, but overall, there has been a very, very big focus, obviously, on COVID response. That has been, an increase, obviously, a very large chunk of our response during that time. But the short answer to your question is it'll obviously be considered in future budgets.
Okay, thank you very much. And a second final question. Deputy Commissioner.
Thank you very much. Minister of the Pacific spokesperson, Mr. Pacific, red talking is in order. Thank you, Minister, for the presentation and for hosting this. With respect to the issues that you talked about, for PNG, we are from Macquarie. People like me, I would not be here if Australians have not contributed through my education. I have Australian teachers, and Australians have made me possible to attend a university and so on. And when you look at the Pacific PNG, our leaders in public service, in business, and politicians are trained, have gotten their education in Australia. Australia has played a role in terms of the human development, as alluded to. And with all the help that you have given to PNG and the Pacific, let me thank you and the Australian government people for the help that you have given to PNG. And you highlighted some of those important projects. Now, when we're looking at the geopolitical, if we have a polling in PNG, which country do you choose? Maybe 95% of the population would choose Australia. Right? Now, and then when you look at all these decision makers, business, public administration, politicians, Australians have played a greater role in terms of shaping and educating them. And for me, and then of course in terms of the ODA program, they've been in the region for decades. Taking all this into consideration in the context of the geopolitical situation in Solomon Islands, and then of course you're aware of the dowry situation. Why are leaders taking that kind of decision? It surprises me. And I think the question that Louise talked about, with respect to all the help that is going into the region, why are our leaders behaving in the way they are behaving? I think it is something, a very important question that Louise asked. Looking back, it's really important to really assess and look at. So I'd like to just reiterate on what Louise said, that we could investigate further. I think it's like a child. The parents are doing all their best, and yet they probably fail in class. It's disappointing. So, anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for those words. And I'll briefly respond. And obviously, that's a matter for those leaders as to why they make some of those decisions, and it's for them to answer to their communities. In terms of what you say, and thank you for saying it in terms of where you believe the people of PNG see Australia and versus other countries, and I think that's something I'm very grateful to hear, and certainly that's the impression I get in other parts of the region, including in places like the Solomon Islands, that the people very much look to Australia, and indeed as the government has when there's been unrest and when there's been trouble, they have turned to Australia for help, and we've been very pleased to respond to that. So thank you for those words. Can I also just, as an aside and a final point, offer my condolences on the death of your Deputy Prime Minister. I had the opportunity to meet with him when I was when I was there last year, and it was a very enjoyable meeting, and I'd spoken to him a number of times on the phone and on Zoom as well, and untimely deaths. So I just wanted to pass on our condolences to your government and to the people of PNG.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Minister. I'll hand over now to Mark.
Thanks, and Minister Seselja, thank you very much for giving a great overview of the Coalition's record on aid and explaining and answering questions. Thank you, Louise, for facilitating the discussion. We really appreciate it. This is the last of our forums held between IDC, DevPol and AgFed, where you get to hear the major parties set out their vision for Australia's aid and development program. We wish all of the candidates well next Saturday. But I'd also like to thank the people that put these forums together, from the Development Policy Centre, Beth Orton, Cam Hill, Harachika Okazaki. He's done a great job wrangling chords and sound. From IDCC, Richard Moore, Joanne Cho and Jane Haycock, and at ACFID, Tim Watkins. So thank you all for contributing today.
Thanks, Mike. Cheers, mate. Thank you. We covered lots of ground, I think.